Lorna. Lorna had acne and long, unruly hair, and liked wearing long, hippie dresses, even during the long, hot days of summer. She had a part-time job at the public library and, in lieu of a social life, worked every Friday night. One particularly quiet Friday, a tall, dark young man came up to the desk and said, "Do you have any books on werewolves?" "Do we have any books on werewolves?" Lorna said, it being standard library procedure to repeat any and all questions from patrons. The young man just stared at her, and Lorna became aware that he was quite good-looking, with fine, aquiline features. Let's have a look in the card catalog," she said finally, stepping from behind the desk. As she walked over to the card drawers, she could feel him behind her, his eyes drinking in her body. We do have a book on werewolves," she told him, unable to totally conceal her surprise that the library owns such a thing. It's called The Book of Werewolves by Sabine Baring-Gould," Lorna said, having unconsciously lowered her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. To herself, Lorna said, "Sabine Baring-Gould. I wonder who she was." "Show it to me," the young man said, and Lorna noticed he had an unusually husky voice. They walked over to the stacks in silence. Lorna was sure he was undressing her with his dark eyes as he followed her into a quiet corner of the building. In the 398s, the folklore section, Lorna pulled a dark green permabound volume off the shelf. Turning to the young man, Lorna whispered, "The Book of Werewolves by the Reverend Sabine Baring-Gould. You know, it says here on the back, he also wrote Onward, Christian Soldiers." "What?" the young man whispered back, his knitted brows forming a single dark line above his hard, staring eyes. It's a hymn," Lorna stammered in amazement. "Everyone knew Onward, Christian Soldiers. Didn't they? "I don't know any hymns," the young man said, grabbing the book and turning away. She heard him mumble something which she thought was thanks, but he didn't turn around. For the rest of her shift, Lorna avoided looking at the young man, and at 9:10, she phoned her father to remind him to pick her up. From the Book of Werewolves by the Reverend Sabine Baring-Gould. In France, in Victorian times, an English clergyman decided to explore some prehistoric standing stones erected by the ancient Druids. The circular cromlech was on a lonely hilltop, and the divine was unable to find it until just before sundown. A tiny village lay at the base of the hill. Not wanting to walk back to the inn in the dark, the clergyman went to the one meager wine shop in search of a carriage, or at least a horse, to convey him the miles back to his destination. But no carriage and no horse was to be had. The village priest offered his fellow clergy the hospitality of his tiny abode, but the minister was determined to return to his inn. "My family is waiting for me there," he said. "They will be worried if I don't come back." The mayor turned to the peasants who sat at the rude tables listening to the conversation. Someone will have to go with Monsieur and guide him back. A statement which led to a general uproar, with all the men talking and gesticulating wildly. The clergyman, who was having some difficulty following the local dialect, realized they seemed to be repeating one particular phrase. Loup-garou! 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 What is the loup-garou? The clergyman said. A wolf? Oh, Monsieur l'Englishman, said one particularly excited peasant. The loup-garou is a fiend, but worse than a fiend, a man-fiend, or even worse, a wolf-man fiend, a werewolf. Picou saw it last week, skulking behind a hedge, said another. It was as big as a calf, its tongue hanging out, and its eyes blazing like marsh flames. What could 2 men, 4 or 5 men do against something like that? As big as a calf, he concluded, crossing himself. I see I have no choice but to return alone, the divine said disapprovingly through pursed lips. In any event, the walk may do me good. But Monsieur, the loup-garou, sputtered the excited peasant. The loup-garou doesn't concern Englishmen, the minister answered curtly as he gathered up his hat and walking stick. Turning to the mayor, he added, If I should happen to meet with the loup-garou, I shall crop his ears and tail and present them to Monsieur le Maire, with my compliments. And then he stepped out into the night. And the next morning, a broken walking stick was found on the ground in front of the mayor's door, and nailed to the door a pair of severed human ears. To be continued. Lorna. For the next dreary week at school, Lorna tried not to think about the strange young man, tried not to think about him, and failed. When Friday came, she tried to pretend she didn't care if he came to the library or not. But of course she cared. At 18, Lorna had never really had a date. Scotty didn't count. So she was really looking forward, hoping to see the mysterious boy again. Maybe he'd talk more this time. She wondered if he'd want that creepy book again. It was still on the shelf. She made sure of that. No one had taken it out, and the young man hadn't borrowed it. The Book of Werewolves by Sabine Baring-Gould. Lorna had looked through it, of course, and found herself both horrified and puzzled. She had never read anything like it, and she didn't believe it, any of it. Werewolves didn't exist, although some of the human monsters mentioned in the book, serial killers, certainly did. As to why the young man wanted to read it, it was silly. It was weird. But guys were like that. Or so Lorna supposed. But Friday night, the odd boy didn't come. Didn't come until the last hour, when it was already dark outside. He came right up to the desk and, staring at Lorna, said, "Where's that book?" This was so rude, Lorna was tempted, momentarily, to tell him he knew where it was and could find it himself. But instead, she stepped out from behind the desk, and together they walked in silence to the 398s, the folklore section. Lorna was in front and wondered if the young man was looking at her rear end, and if so, what he thought of it, of her. Did he like her? Maybe he was just shy. In the 398s, Lorna took the green permabound volume down from the shelf. "The Book of Werewolves by Sabine Baring-Gould," she said. Once again, the young man snatched it from her and was turning away when he stopped and, looking at her intently, said, "What time do you leave here?" The library closes at 9, Lorna said. He turned away then, without another word, and, walking to a table in the back corner, sat down and began to read with total absorption. Lorna wondered why he had asked when she got off work. Was he thinking of asking her out? Still, at 10 to 9, Lorna called her dad to remind him to pick her up, and when she went to look, the young man was gone. From the Book of Werewolves by the Reverend Sabine Baring-Gould. In Roman times, a slave decided to take advantage of his master's absence to visit a girlfriend who lived in the country. A house guest, a soldier on leave, agreed to come with him. They set out in the early evening and were soon overtaken by darkness. The sides of the road were lined with tombstones, and after they had been on the road a while, the soldier excused himself to urinate. At least, that's what the slave thought he was doing. But after waiting 10 minutes for the soldier's return, he decided to see what was taking so long. The slave was amazed to see the soldier had removed all his clothes and stood naked, awash in moonlight. And then, suddenly, he turned into a great gray wolf, which howled at the night and then raced off into some nearby woods. The slave almost took to his heels, but then decided he should gather up the soldier's discarded clothes. He would need them later, if he turned back into a man. And if he didn't, the slave could always sell them. But alas, the garments had been turned to marble. Marble! The slave continued on his way and eventually arrived at the farm where Melissa was waiting impatiently. "If you had only come here sooner," she said with a degree of annoyance, "you might at least have lent us a hand." "Why? What happened?" the slave answered defensively. "A wolf broke into the barn and attacked the cattle, that's all. But it was no laughing matter for Mr. Wolf, since one of our servants managed to run him through with a pike." The slave spent the night. The next morning, on his way home, he paused at the place where the clothes had been turned to stone, but found a large pool of gore. Gore! gore instead of the bewitched garments. The slave reached home and almost bumped into a departing guest, a local doctor looking exceedingly grave. It seems he had been called in the night to treat his master's guest, the soldier, who had returned home with a serious neck wound. The result of some brawl, the physician croaked. No doubt over a woman. And how is he? The slave asked tremulously. The doctor smiled sourly. The soldier bled to death. To be continued. For the next rather dreary week at school, Lorna couldn't get the strange boy out of her mind. She could hardly wait for Friday night, for her Friday night shift at the library, but the strange young man never came. Now on this particular Friday night, Lorna's dad had to go to a meeting and was unable to pick her up. No big deal. She could walk. It was a nice night for a walk, too. Fall, but still reasonably warm. Unseasonably warm. Lorna stepped out onto the plaza in front of the library building, only to find the mysterious young man striding towards her. "Is it still open?" he barked at Lorna. Lorna was once again taken aback by the weird boy's abrupt manner. The library closes at 9, she sputtered. "So I can't go in?" "Well, no," Lorna said out loud, but to herself she said, "What is wrong with him? This isn't normal. Can I see the book again?" He obviously meant that peculiar volume, the Book of Werewolves by Sabine Baring-Gould. You can see it tomorrow," Lorna told him. "I can't see it tonight?" "Well, no." The young man kept staring at her, making Lorna feel extremely uncomfortable. Was he trying to undress her with his eyes? Then suddenly he said, "Where are you going now?" "Home." Lorna was really feeling uncomfortable. "Walking?" he said. "Yeah." "Alone?" It was none of his darn business, Lorna thought, but she answered, "Yeah." "I'll walk with you. It isn't safe for you to be walking alone." From the Book of Werewolves by the Reverend Sabine Baring-Gould. Zygmunt thought of taking his youngest son, Ulf, on his next voyage of murder and pillage. But he wanted to test him first. So that summer they took to the woods and lived as rogues, murdering unwary travelers for their goods. Ulf proved an apt pupil. One day they came across a hut in which 2 men were sleeping. Zygmunt noticed both men wore rings and chains of gold, but he also noticed the 2 wolf skins hanging upon the wall. "This smacks of witchcraft," he whispered to Ulf. "When they don the wolf skins, they are transformed and live as wolves. But on the 10th day, they regain their mortal form and are overcome with exhaustion. Observe! They sleep like the dead." "Then let us make them really dead and use their enchanted skins for our own purposes," Ulf said. An apt pupil indeed. And so they killed the sleeping men, took their gold, and then put on the wolf skins and instantly turned into howling wolves. Yet they still retained the ability to speak. Now listen to me, commanded Sigmund. Let us go into the forest and each go his own way. You can easily take on up to 7 mortal men. 7 mortal men, but don't try to take on more than 7. If you should be attacked by more than 7, commence to howl, and I will come at once to your assistance. Yes, father, answered Ulf. Do as I tell you, Sigmund continued, for you are young and daring, and men would gladly chase you. They parted company, but it was not long before Sigmund encountered a party of 9 men. So he howled, and Ulf came a-charging, and between them they killed all 9. Again they parted, and this time Ulf came across a group of 11 stout hunters. But the bloodlust was upon him, and instead of howling for his father's aid, he attacked and tore all 11 to pieces. The mayhem left Ulf exhausted, and he lay down beneath an oak tree, panting for breath. Sigmund padded up, and observing the carnage, said angrily, Ulf, why did you not howl for help? As if I needed your help to kill a mere 11 men, Ulf answered sarcastically. Seeing red, Sigmund threw himself on his son, and before he realized what he was doing, he had torn out Ulf's throat, the boy's crimson blood staining the grass beneath the oak. Heartbroken, Sigmund managed to get the dead body upon his back and returned home, where he lay the corpse on a bier, and sitting beside it, said over and over and over, Devil take the wolf skins! Devil take the wolf skins! Lorna and the young man walked in pregnant silence. When she could finally stand it no more, Lorna said, what's your name? Lawrence. That was all he said. Nothing more. Lawrence. He didn't ask me my name, Lorna said to herself. Maybe he already knows it. They continued in silence for 15 minutes before they finally reached the top of Lorna's street. I just live down here, she began to say, as a ripe, bright full moon suddenly appeared over the rooftops. The young man stood staring at it, his eyes bulging out of their sockets, and then he shifted his gaze to Lorna. Oh, my God! My God! He screamed. It's happening! It's happening! And he ran off into the night. Lorna stared after him, and then she laughed or made some kind of sound. She was glad her dad wasn't there to see this. To be continued. Lorna. Lorna never saw the strange young man ever again. Instead, the next time that her dad was unable to pick her up after her Friday shift, it was Scotty who offered to walk her home. Scotty was a good boy. He was also short, slight, and set upon by every bully at school. Scotty was also infatuated with Lorna, although he had yet to ask her out. At 18, Scotty had never had a date. He figured walking Lorna home would be a good first step towards asking her out. It was a beautiful October night. Beautiful. But Lorna wouldn't stop talking about some strange guy who'd been coming into the library. He always wanted the same book, Lorna babbled on, and on, and on, and on. It was called The Book of Werewolves by some minister called Sabine Baring-Gould. It's a very strange old book, and kind of silly, Lorna continued. So I had to read it to find out what was so fascinating about it. Really, Scotty muttered. Some of the stories in there, Lorna gushed, are kind of sick. Elizabeth was 40 years old now, and afraid she was losing both her looks and her husband's affection. As a result, she spent several hours each morning dressing and applying her makeup. One morning, one of her maids had been clumsy and had made a mistake arranging her mistress's headdress, causing an enraged Elizabeth to slam her face so hard she split the maid's lip, making it spurt blood. Some of the blood splattered Elizabeth's face, but when the blood drops were washed off, her skin appeared much more beautiful, whiter and more transparent on those places where the blood had been. Elizabeth formed the resolution to bathe her face and her whole body in human blood so as to enhance her beauty, Lorna lectured Scotty, who found the whole thing rather morbid. But not just any blood. The blood of young virginal women. Elizabeth employed 2 old women and a hunchback named Fitzko to assist her. Fitzko would kill the luckless victims, the old women then collecting the blood, which was put into a tub where Elizabeth would bathe at the hour of 4 a.m. After the bath, she appeared more beautiful than ever, or so she thought. Following the death of her husband in 1604, Elizabeth continued to bathe in blood, hoping it would continue to enhance her beauty and her chances of a new husband. Young women were lured to the castle with the promise of work, only to find themselves imprisoned in the dungeon, where they were whipped and tortured. Elizabeth, not infrequently, tortured the victims herself, often changing her clothes, which dripped with blood, before renewing her cruelties. After the bodies had been milked of blood, the remains were burned. Elizabeth's sadism became so great, she would even stick needles into those who sat with her, especially if they were young women. One of her servant girls she stripped naked, smeared her with honey, and so drove her out of the house, and to a horrible death in the forest. Scotty had been listening to this recital in stunned silence. He was astonished to hear Lorna speaking about such things with such glee. "That book is obscene," he sputtered. Lorna continued, as if she hadn't heard him. "They say Elizabeth Bathorny was responsible for the murder of 650 young women and girls. Eventually, her outrages were so outrageous, the castle was stormed and the evidence of mass murder found. Fitzko and the old women were burned at the stake, while Elizabeth was walled up alive. In darkness, they left only a small slit in the wall, through which they passed her meals. She lived 3 years that way. 3 years alone in the dark until she too was dead. It took Scotty a moment to realize Lorna had finished talking, but when he did, he blurted, "What a disgusting woman. You know, Lorna, I don't think it's quite healthy to read stuff like that." Lorna chuckled, causing Scotty to look at her sharply. "Do you think I'm beautiful, Scotty? Do you think I'm lovely?" The full moon had risen above the nearby suburban rooftops and caught Lorna's face in its silvery rays. As Scotty stared at her, Lorna's pale complexion began to darken, began to coarsen, and he saw with horror that large patches of thick gray hair were sprouting over her cheeks, covering her acne. Lorna's button nose elongated into a snout, her panting mouth now full of rows of sharp, gleaming teeth as her eyes took on a reddish glare. The chuckle had morphed into a growl, and then Lorna tore out Scotty's throat. In the end, Lorna must have really liked Scotty. In fact, she just ate him up. There was no trial, of course. Lorna was pronounced insane and taken directly to the asylum. When the authorities eventually learned about the Book of Werewolves, they went to the library to examine it. But the book was missing. The end. Are you sure? They were cruising round after midnight, listening to tunes and talking trash. Big Alex, was driving. "Did you hear about Lorna?" Tim said. "Who?" Kenton said. "You know, Lorna. Chick used to work at the library. The one never combed her hair, with the zits?" Big Alex said loudly, as usual. "Who cares?" Kenton snickered. "I'm surprised you guys don't know about her," Tim said, obviously wanting to tell tales, if not secrets. "Know what? That she ate that little runt Scott? He probably gave her the shits," Big Alex practically shouted. "She's locked up in the insane asylum," Kenton said. "She was," Tim said. "She escaped." "What do you want to bet? She makes a beeline for McDonald's," Alex chortled, laughing at his own near wit. "McDonald's or Burger King." "Who cares?" Kenton shrugged. "She won't get far." "Yeah? She escaped 3 months ago." Big Alex and Kenton were silent. For once. After a minute or so, Kenton spoke quietly. "Shit. Wonder if she's killed anyone else." "Who knows?" Big Alex laughed. "After all, she likes to eat the evidence." They howled, and they hooted, and they hooted, and they howled with laughter, and Tim, who was the quiet one, had just started to say, "She had this job at the library, eh?" when they saw the young woman. She was standing on the shoulder of the road, clad in a white nightdress, her dark hair covering her face. As the car raced past, she raised her arms and shrieked. What the fuck? Alex bawled. It looked like that chick from the ring, Kenton yelled, actually sounding shocked. I bet it was Lorna, Tim said quietly. You're nuts. Let's go back, Big Alex said as he pulled into a nearby parking lot in order to turn around. I want to get this on my phone. They drove back to the spot where the young woman had been standing and stopped to look around. But she had gone. Vanished. Where the hell did she go? Big Alex sounded pissed off. We, didn't imagine it, did we? Kenton suggested, with, some degree of hesitation. No way. That chick was real. Really there. You didn't really think she was going to wait around for us, did you? Tim laughed. She could be anywhere now. Big Alex was philosophical. Too bad. It would have made a real spooky video. Which is when she came screaming out of the ditch at them. The woman, thing, was still clad in a stained and dirty white nightdress. But she had been transformed. They could see her face this time. And it wasn't the acne-laced face of a young woman, but the face of a beast, covered with thick gray hair or fur, with an elongated snout, rows of gleaming white teeth and flaming red eyes. In short, the face of a wolf. A werewolf. Big Alex slammed his foot down on the accelerator, and the car, a bright red Kia Soul, slammed into motion. Hope the bitch don't scratch the paint, Alex yelped, more concerned about the car than about anything else. What was that? A fucking werewolf? Kenton sputtered. While Tim was praying they didn't hit any red lights. Kenton was sitting in the back and nervously glanced out the rear window and... Holy shit! It's chasing us. Now Tim really was praying. It was true. The thing, werewolf, whatever it was in hot pursuit. And it was gaining on them. That must be Lorna, Tim cried. That's why she killed and ate Scotty. Scotty, she's a lycanthrope. Say what? Alex yelled. They were rapidly approaching a busy shopping district, but there was surprisingly little traffic. In fact, there was no traffic at all. Big Alex had his foot down on the accelerator, and they were going faster and faster and faster and faster. I can't see her. Now, Kenton yelled. And then he yelled, Oh my God! She's in the car! A woman sat in the back with Kenton. A woman in a soiled white nightdress with gray matted arms ending in dark claws. A woman with a canine snout, fetid breath, rows of sharp white teeth, and flaming red eyes. It was Lorna, and she was a werewolf. She was a lycanthrope. She tried to throw herself into the front seat and sunk her fangs into one of Alex's arms, the blood splattering on the windshield. Out of control, the red soul, traveling well over 100, careened off the road and wound up on the lot of a service station, where it hit the gas pumps and exploded into flame. Into an erupting fireball. When emergency services arrived, they found Lorna, just a plain young woman with acne and unkempt hair, sitting on the edge of a nearby ditch, calmly eating a badly singed arm. Big Alex's right arm. Guess, she liked barbecue. Lorna is now in a secure facility from which escape is impossible. Are you sure? Pictures used in today's video, courtesy of Pix here, that's PX here, while the music was the haunting Ghost Processional by that patron of the internet, Kevin MacLeod.